you all are doing well wherever you're at in the country. I am well this week. As you may be able to tell by the lighting in the room today, the sun has returned, so my heart is joyful for that. We had 12 solid days of rain here in Raleigh, and there was a noticeable uptick in my disposition on Tuesday when the sun finally decided to return. So I am grateful for that. So this week we are talking about deviance, which is actually probably one of students' most favorite things to talk about, and understandably so. It's kind of a fun thing to talk about in a college classroom. First off, let's talk a little bit about what deviance is from the sociological perspective. And sociologists tend to approach the topic of deviance in a way that's quite dissimilar than how we think about it in mainstream society or in everyday life, which is probably not surprising at this point in the semester. So kind of the mainstream conception of deviance is that it entails acts that are bad or that are wrong, and that definition implies that there's some type of like inherent immorality associated with deviant acts. Sociologists, in contrast, think of deviance as being something that is socially constructed. So what constitutes deviance depends on what is considered the norm for any given society. So to kind of give you the textbook definition, which you'll be reading on your own, but just to reinforce that, deviance is any behavior that violates a norm. Norms are what we talked about when we did our culture unit. So examples of deviance include alcoholism, mental illness, murder, pornography, bulimia, panhandling, anything ranging from small acts of deviance, maybe stepping into an elevator before the passengers that are in it have already exited, would be considered a small act of awkward deviance, all the way up to murder, which is a more extreme act. So considering the socially constructed nature of deviance, it should be pretty obvious that what qualifies as deviance or deviant acts will vary across subcultures within any given society. And so what is deviant to one group in society may not be considered deviant at all to another. The book, I believe, gives this example of drug usage within the hippie counterculture. Drug usage was not a deviant act as part of this social movement, but it was seen as deviance by larger society. Deviance also varies between societies, and that makes intuitive sense considering how norms vary by societies. And this is where ethnocentrism can come into play sometimes, a term, again, that we learned whenever we talked about culture a couple of weeks ago, where sometimes whenever we see other cultures committing things that we would consider deviant in our own culture, we have a hard time not reacting to that in an ethnocentric way. And again, that kind of speaks to the importance of cultural relativism in the discipline of sociology. Lastly, deviance, what qualifies as deviance? I feel very itchy today. I'm sorry if this is making any of you uneasy. Maybe it's, I don't know, the changing seasons. Lastly, another point to consider whenever you're thinking about the social construction of deviance is that it often varies across time within any given society. So a really great kind of funny example of this is how cough drops used to have a drop of cocaine in them, and so in today's society we consider drug usage, cocaine usage to be highly deviant, whereas 100 years ago this was actually something that you could purchase over the counter to alleviate coughs or sore throat. There are a couple of theories of deviance that McIntyre includes in the text we're using for this course. McIntyre is actually a criminologist, and so deviance is kind of her shtick. So this is a really well done chapter. One theory that she talks about is strain theory. Well, actually, I'm sorry, let me pause here and back up just very briefly. Typically, whenever people try to explain deviance, they tend to kind of pinpoint it on the individual, that this individual is immoral or deficient in some way, or there is something wrong with this individual. Sociologists, not surprisingly, especially at this point in the semester, it shouldn't surprise you all, tend to focus much more on kind of the social environment and how the social environment helps us to explain and understand deviance. Thinking back to one of our first weeks of class when we read about Hernando Washington, I asked you all to compare and contrast the individualistic and the sociological explanations for the acts that he committed and the response he had towards those acts. That's very relevant to what we're discussing this week. Okay, so going forward, thinking about a couple of sociological theories that help us explain and understand deviant acts. The first is strain theory. And again, McIntyre includes a lot of detail in her chapter in terms of what strain theory actually is, but I'm going to kind of give you the big picture of it, the strain theory in a nutshell. And it basically goes like this. Any given society has goals, has values that people are encouraged to aspire to. This is a part of our collective consciousness, the social oil that makes things work smoothly. We all learn this, we all know this through culture, through socialization. And whenever, for a variety of reasons, certain people are unable to achieve that collective consciousness or feel a part of that collective consciousness, when people are prevented from achieving those goals or realizing those values, then they may resort to deviant acts. That, again, can occur in a couple of ways. McIntyre talks about structural strain, egoism, which occurs when a person is not well integrated into society, when they're not familiar or they don't feel like they are a member of the collective consciousness, or there's anomie, which is when norms cannot be met in legitimate ways. So a lot of times this theory is used to explain the prevalence of crime and drug usage in inner city areas that have very impoverished economic structures surrounding them. Where jobs and more than that, good, decent jobs are not readily available. And seeing as how having a job, having gainful employment, and going along with that, having money and having things that you're able to consume is kind of this major goal in American society. We're a very consumer-driven society. For people who are unable to achieve that goal through legitimate means, i.e. a middle-class job, they may resort to deviant acts to still reach that goal. Another theory to consider is labeling theory. And so this one focuses on the response that people receive once they commit a primary act of deviance. Much as the title of this theory suggests, once people receive that label of deviant, they are much more likely to then engage in further deviant acts. You can think of this as a self-fulfilling prophecy in some ways. And hopefully a lot of you can see how this may be directly relevant to what we learned in our socialization topic in terms of Cooley's looking glass self, where we base our conception of ourself based on how others are perceiving us. So the last thing I want to touch on in this week's lecture are the functions of deviance. And again, this is another example of when sociologists kind of deviate from mainstream thinking on things, because again, people think of deviant, and mainstream ideas of deviance typically think of them as wrong, as immoral, and to say that there might be something positive associated with these acts can maybe give us a little bit of pause and make us question what could be functional about deviance. This actually, not surprisingly, comes from Durkheim, Emil Durkheim. It's not Emily. Sometimes people want to mistake him for an Emily. So Durkheim talks about how deviance can unite a community, which is very true. Most, if not all of us in class probably experienced this after the tragedy of 9/11. What the hijackers did was horrible, obviously. Thousands of innocent people were murdered. But in the aftermath of that, America as a country really came together and bonded and became much stronger as a society, at least for a period of time. Deviance also helps clarify society's norms and social boundaries. I know what's wrong because of the response I receive when I do it. And without that response, then those boundaries wouldn't be as clear. And lastly, and my most favorite function of deviance, if you will, it can often result in social change. When you think about the progress we've made as a country, a lot of that progress is through acts of deviance, beginning with the founding of America by the early revolutionists who stood up against the imperial power of Great Britain. You can think about actors in the civil rights movement who engaged in acts of deviance to promote racial equality. Same could be said for the women's rights movement. We have movements going on today across our country where people are engaged in acts of deviance, and in their eyes, it is in an attempt to create meaningful social change in our society. So that is all that I have to say about deviance. It does seem like this has been kind of a short lecture to give, but again, I think that the textbook once again does a great job in explaining this topic very thoroughly. So if you have any questions or comments as you are pondering thoughts of sociological deviance over the next week, please send them my way. And I hope you all have a lovely week. I'll see you next week. Bye.